Our next two presenters, I guess, remind us of the human impact of the violations that we're talking about today. I think a lot of what we end up talking about could become high principles. Some of it might sound quite optimistic, and much of it, I think, we could be in danger of losing touch with the actual events and the actual people involved in 1988. So the purpose of the next two presentations, I guess, is to hear from people who have that very direct connection back to those events, so that we don't lose a sense of the very real emotional and psychological side of our content today. So our next presenter is Dr. Chara Makarimi. And again, Chara's biography is in front of you, but she's an anthropologist and a researcher at the French National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris. In terms of her presentation today, she's going to be talking about the fact that her mother was killed during the 1988 prison massacre, and Chara has written a book about these events, and we're very glad to have you here with us today. Chara, thanks very much.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Boroumand Foundation and Lodan and Roya Boroumand for the wonderful job they're doing and for organizing this event and inviting us to take part in it. Most of the things I know about the imprisonment, torture, and execution of my mother and my aunt come through a memoir my grandfather wrote in the last years of his life, after the massacre of the summer '88, during which my mother was executed. It took me 6 years to translate this 80-page testimony. During these years, I had a memorable dream. I dreamt that I was with a lot of other people, a whole population, locked in a large cave made of small stone cells. Mine had a window over the sea. Others, like those where my Iranian family lived, were saturated with smoky air, and their inhabitants were suffocating. All of a sudden, a fierce explosion expelled us all from the cave. I walked and found myself in a camp where a small food stall was set up. At the table, my mother and my late aunt Fatone, executed in '88 and '82 respectively, were sitting in their prison suit, wearing the prisoner's marnae and the chador. They were young. They were young and smiling. Their eyes bright and their cheeks pink. Their sister, another aunt who now lives in Shiraz after 10 years of hiding during the 1980s, was sitting there too, wearing the same uniform. Surprised, I asked her why she was with them. She stared at me and answered, "But I never left them. I have been with them all along." I sat at the table, smiling back at them. But soon I noticed that my mother and my aunts were exchanging anxious looks, trying to protect me from a difficult truth. The watch at Aunt Fatane's wrist, the one the guards gave back to my grandfather along with her wedding ring to inform the family of her execution in October '82. The watch was marking the end of my visit. They knew it was almost time for me to leave, but they didn't have the heart to tell me so. I caught their furtive looks and wondered what was going on. Suddenly, all my body began to shake furiously and endlessly, as I was surrounded by their hearty face, trying to calm me down. Their youngest sister, with whom I grew up at my grandparents' house, was coming for me. She carried a wheelbarrow. As we walked back together, she told me we still had plenty of work to do. "What work?" I asked. And there we were, on the site of the explosion. Of the cave, the cells, and the house, the thousands of people buried by the explosion, nothing remained but a cliff over the sea. The earth was grey as ashes, and an arm was lying there. I was 8 months old when my mother was arrested and imprisoned in Hyderabad in Shiraz on the 15th of June 1981, and my father went into hiding. First, my grandparents, who were in charge of me, spent hours queuing and begging in vain for a daily visit permit so my mother could breastfeed me. We were finally able to see her after she was trialed and sentenced to 10 years of prison. We visited my mother once a week from my 1 to almost my 6th year, when my brother and I joined my father, who had been granted refugee status in France. The situation of others was worse. Some children were kept in prison with their parents. Aunt Fatone was pregnant when she was arrested along with her fellow Mojahed, who was also pregnant. My aunt was executed when she was 7 to 8 months pregnant. We never knew what became of the baby. Her friend Zahra, who was sentenced to death as well, gave birth to her baby in prison and kept it with her in the ward until the little girl was 2. The baby was then given to the family and her mother executed. For years, the girl, named Zahra like her mother, shouted and ran away whenever she saw a man. For her, they were a race of torturers and guards. During her almost 8 years of prison, my mother spent long periods in the Sepa Special Detention Center, or the Ward 3000 of the Evin prison in Tehran, where she was tortured and kept in solitary confinement. We would not know where she was or whether she was alive or not. But when she was in Adelabat prison, we had a weekly visit in presence. When I turned 3 and my brother 6, our visits were restricted to phone calls behind a window glass. The blindfold she had to wear used to terrify me and made me scream, my grandfather wrote. One of her cellmates, who I spoke to, recalled how my mother's palms were always bloody when she came back from her visits. She had been clenching her wrists, planting her nails in her flesh. Unfortunately, I keep no clear memory of these hours in prison. I remember the dust and the hallway where family were waiting. I remember being escorted with my brother in a backdoor office where a tiny woman in shadow took our hands. But of her face, I have no memory. My mother was supposed to be released in March 1989. My father hoped she would exit the country immediately, and he had booked a room in a French hospital so she could recover and rest. In June 1988, my mother had a last visit with her family. Then the prison closed, and prisoners and their families entered the blackout of summer 1988. In early December, the families were gathered in Adelabat prison and received the news of their relatives' execution. My grandparents were given a paper indicating the emplacement of my mother's graves in Shiraz Cemetery. However, my grandmother found out that another woman, who was dead decades before, had been buried under this grave. Other prisoners' relatives had the same experience, and it appeared, as my grandfather reports, that ancient graves had been recovered with cement and presented to the families as their beloved ones. Families have been informed of their relatives' execution after the 40th day following their death, which marks the end of the period of mourning in Shiite Islam. They didn't know how their children, siblings, or spouses had been buried. They didn't know where the burial site was, and they still don't know. And they were not allowed to organize mourning ceremonies or to tell their co-workers, their neighbors, or their schoolmates about what had happened. I was 8 years old when my father told us that my mother had died. I did not listen to a word of what he was trying to tell us that day. I understood that my mother died of vitamin deficiency because she had no son in her prison. I led on this story until quite late, around the age of 13, and it took me 6 more years to understand that my mother's execution was not an isolated case, but one among thousands during the mass killing of 1988. As witnesses, we have to manage the tricks of our mind that erases and fades those specific experiences which are now so precious for accounting justice. But something more makes it difficult for me to be a good witness. And I'm aware of the ambiguity these terms imply. Living in France from the age of 6, I did not grow up in a society where I had to bear the stigma associated with families of political prisoners in Iran in the 1980s, and the shame and humiliation of having to hide the reason for my mother's death. I didn't feel excluded in a society that builds its identity by demonizing and annihilating the one person I am supposed to love and respect, my mother. However, there are testimonies which demonstrate how the mass execution of thousands of parents have weighed and continues to weigh on their children's experience, personality, identity, and fate. This was the case of Sarah Azad, which I had renamed so to respect her anonymity, and Omid Montazeri, whose case has been publicly followed in the press. Sarah was 6 months old when she was arrested along with her mother and father in 1986. She was imprisoned with her mother, who was released 2 months after her arrest, although she stayed under judiciary control. Her father was sentenced to 15 years of prison and jailed in Evin in Tehran. He was executed in the summer of 1988. Sarah's mother was interrogated weekly by the Interior Ministry for several years after that. Sarah grew up and learned to write "killed in a car accident" in the school forms. She was forbidden to tell her schoolmates about her father's death. She then preferred to invent an imaginary father who was always traveling for professional reasons. At the age of 14, She learned about the existence of the mass graves in Khavaran, and since then she took part in the annual commemoration and flower planting there. When she entered university, she was summoned to the dean's office. School authorities told her they knew who she was and warned her that she faced expulsion if she said anything about the conditions of her father's death. In 2008, Sarah joined a student journal and collaborated to the arts and culture column. In early April 2009, the journal was closed by the Interior Ministry. After the elections, Sarah and her mother took part in the protest against electoral fraud. On the 10th of July, Sarah's mother was summoned to the Ministry of Education, on which she depended as a high school teacher. Her teaching license was cancelled, and she was interrogated by an agent of the Interior Ministry, who said that she had been her interrogator and torturer during her prison time in 1985. After the Ashura protest in December, Omid Montazeri, one of the founders of the student journal to which Sarah collaborated as well, and son of a prisoner executed in 1988 himself, was arrested along with his mother. A few days after, another daughter of a prisoner executed in 1988 was arrested and accused of being one of the leaders of the unrest. Pressured by her mother, who was very worried about the fact that the arrests were targeting children of former political prisoners, Sarah left the town with her. At 11 the same evening, 4 men and 1 woman from the security forces came to her place to arrest her. She was accused of being a leader of the post-election unrest, as a warrant specified. In the following weeks, they interrogated her relatives and friends. The interrogations, which aimed at identifying her as a leader of the protest movement, focused on the links with her father's fate and his political engagement. How could she possibly hate us? How could she possibly not hate us after what we did to her father? They asked her grandfather, as he reported to her. The title of a folder was Elements in Relation to Marxism. Her father was a Marxist. Sarah's annual visit to the Khavaran cemetery had all been recorded and were of specific significance for the interrogators who hold them as proofs. In spring 2010, Sarah exited Iran through Turkey and later went to France when she was granted the refugee status. Sarah had taken part in many public demonstrations from summer to winter 2009. However, the question for her remains why she had been targeted by post-electoral repression, although her contributions to the student journal were limited to the art and culture columns. Why did the security forces look for her and not for more active contributors writing on political or socioeconomic issues? Why did they target her among hundreds of other protesters who demonstrated during this month? The interrogators in charge of her file made it clear that there was a method and a logic in their repression. They were targeting the children and spouses of those executed in 1988, as the case of Omid Montazeri showed publicly. Omid's parents were arrested in July 1986 when his mother was pregnant with him. Omid's father was imprisoned in Evin and later executed during the massacre of 1988, and he had not been tried. On the 28th of December 2009, right after the Ashura protest, Iranian security forces entered Omid's home and arrested his mother along with other friends and guests. Omid was arrested upon his arrival at the Ministry of Intelligence to obtain information on his mother and her guests. He was accused of being a leader of the post-election unrest, imprisoned in Evin, interrogated, and sent to solitary confinement. His public confessions were filmed and partly transmitted on TV. Interestingly, although the mass execution of political prisoners in 1988 has been denied by authorities and the families were pressured to keep the event secret, Omid was presented in his trial as the son of a prisoner executed in 1988. Omid was sentenced to 6 years of suspended prison term on February 27, 2010. He exited Iran in 2011.